Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, and good night, depending on where you are in the world. As you can see, I am joined by Dr. Schrader today, and we're going to be doing an interview on the Crusader states and what was life like in the Crusader states. I'll just pull up a little bit of an introduction. Bear with us one second. So just a little bit about Dr. Schrader. She earned her PhD cum laude in history from the University of Hamburg, and served as an American diplomat in various diplomatic posts in Europe and Africa. She is the author of works of both popular history and historical fiction. Her novels, particularly those set in the era of the Crusades, have won numerous literary awards, including Best Biography 2017 for a novel on the life of the historical Balin de Ibelin. I hope I pronounced that right. And the Best Historical Fiction 2020 for a novel on the struggle between Frederick II Hohenstaufen, hope I pronounced that correctly, and his barons in Outrima. And for details of both of these, you can go to helenaschrader.com, and that will appear in the description box down below for this. We're going to be talking around the book that's recently been published, The Holy Land in the Era of the Crusades, which kind of offers a much-needed overview of the history and characteristics of the Crusader states during the tumultuous era of the Crusades. Most importantly, the groundbreaking work based on the 21st century research refutes popular misconceptions about the idea of the genocidal and proto-colonial nature of the Christian kingdoms established in the Near East in the wake of the Crusades. It highlights both the harmonious coexistence between Muslims, Jews, and Christians in the heart of the Holy Land, as well as the contributions of these kingdoms to the development of Western Europe. Now, as we always do when we're doing these things, we're going to start with a prayer. And I've helped Dr. Schrader pick the psalm for today because I thought it was appropriate. So, Dr. Helena, would you care to lead us in a prayer through reading the psalm?
I will try. I will do my best.
Don't worry.
Not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory, for the sake of your steadfast love and your faithfulness. Why should the nations say, where is their God? Our God is in the heavens. He does all that he pleases. Their idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths, but do not speak, eyes, but do not see. They have ears, but do not hear, noses, but do not smell. They have hands, but do not feel, feet, but do not walk, and they do not make a sound in their throat. Those who make them become like them, so do all who trust in them. O Israel, trust in the Lord. He is thy help and thy shield. O house of Aaron, trust in the Lord. He is their help and their shield. You who fear the Lord, trust in the Lord. He is their help and their shield. The Lord has remembered us. He will bless us. He will bless the house of Israel. He will bless the house of Aaron. He will bless those who fear the Lord, both the small and the great. May the Lord increase you and your children. May you be blessed by the Lord who made heaven and earth. The heavens are the Lord's heavens, but the earth he has given to the children of man. The dead do not praise the Lord, nor do they who go down into silence. But we will bless the Lord from this time forth and forevermore. Praise to the Lord.
This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, Dr. Schrader. I'm hoping pronouncing your name right. I'm very conscious that I didn't get any of the German right. Great. So obviously our topic's going to be on the Crusades. The Crusader states and life inside them. But I think before we begin, we should probably start by just giving a brief explanation of why the Crusades happened and how the Crusader states were set up.
That's a large start. I want to start with fundamentals, and that is that whatever date you want to name, Jesus Christ was born in the Holy Land, or what we now call the Holy Land, in Palestine. And he was crucified in Jerusalem and Christians believe that he also rose from the dead in Jerusalem.
Amen.
The word name Jerusalem does not occur in the Qur'an. In the 12th century, it was basically not agreed, in fact, it was doubted, that Jerusalem was the site of Muhammad's night journey. And there was no agreement on the fact that he went to heaven from Jerusalem. In other words, Jerusalem is without doubt the holiest city for Christianity, because it was the place where Jesus Christ came to earth and lived and died. The holiest city of Islam is Mecca. The second most holy city is Medina, where Muhammad lived. And the third most city of Islam is greatly debated, and there are many candidates for it, only one of which is Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a Christian city from the time that Christianity became, well, from the death of Christ. There were Christians in Jerusalem that kept the faith of Christ alive during the Roman oppression. And they came out from that oppression with when Constantine the Great came to the throne in Constantinople. And when his mother came to his mother, who was Christian, Helena, my namesake, you may have noticed, went to Jerusalem as an old woman, I think she was 80, to try to find the site of Christ's crucifixion. She was helped by the fact that there were still Christians who had lived there, whose grandparents had memories and had traditions. But most importantly, she was helped by the fact that the Romans, to insult the Christians, had built a temple to Venus on the site of the tomb. Therefore, by going back to that Roman temple and digging under the temple, they found caves in one of which there were 3 crosses. It is believed by Christians that is the site of Christ's crucifixion. And was his site of his tomb and crucifixion next to each other, in relative close proximity. And from that, and immediately afterwards, the Emperor Constantine funded a massive cathedral or church, a basilica, to be built on that site. And that has been called, since then, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and was recognized as the holiest church in Christendom from that time forward. Jerusalem, of course, was part of the Byzantine Empire at that, part of the Eastern Roman, or part of the Roman Empire. It became part of the Eastern Roman Empire. And it fell to the Persians. I'm going to get the dates right. I'm going to check my chronology to be absolutely sure I get the exact dates right. But it was conquered by the Persians in 614 AD, is when basically Jerusalem falls to a Persian army. The inhabitants are slaughtered. They're talking about 26,500 people slaughtered, and more than 35,000 women and children taken into slavery. It was 629 before the Byzantine emperors were able to retake Jerusalem. And then they had not really had much chance to restore the population or do much to it before the first Muslim conquest. The Muslim conquest came in 637. So Jerusalem falls to the forces of Caliph Umar the Great after a 1-year siege in 637. And it remains in Muslim hands then until what we now know of as what we now call the First Crusade in 1099. During that entire period of Muslim occupation, Jerusalem changes hands 5 times between Sunnis and Shias. There's a revolt against the Muslim rule. And meanwhile, the armies of Islam have swept across all the way to the gates of Constantinople. They laid siege to Constantinople twice. They take Sicily, they take Cyprus, they take Crete, they take northern Africa, and they go all the way across Spain and go to the Loire, where they're finally stopped by Karl Martel at the Battle of Poitiers. During that period, all of that period, Jerusalem has not been forgotten. It's simply that the Christians were not in a position to fight back. But the Byzantine Empire does recover, does gets close. It recovers some Anatolia, but it never recovers Palestine. And it is again threatened by the Seljuk Turks when it sends an appeal in 1187, in 1095, not 95, and then 1086, sorry, 1086, the great city of Antioch, huge Christian city, long part of the Byzantine Empire, one of the holiest cities of Christendom as well, because of early ties, falls to the Muslims for a second time, this time to the Turks. And after that, the Byzantine Empire is basically in retreat again and seeks aid from the West. And they requested support from the now much stronger and increasingly economically viable and successful Western kingdoms, particularly appealing to them through the Pope. And the Pope then goes in 1095, at the Council of Clermont, the Pope makes a very impassioned appeal to the Knights of France to go to the rescue of Christ's homeland. The appeal is based in part on the Byzantine request for help, but the Byzantine emperor basically imagined he was just going to get mercenaries to fight in his armies and fight back against the Seljuks. The Pope altered that appeal and appealed emotionally based on the concept of just war, which says that Christianity, basically a peaceful religion, a religion that abhors violence, but Christians are justified in taking up arms to defend the weak and to stop aggression. I'm summarizing. If you may have had other sessions, maybe you want to have someone come in and talk about the concept of just war. But St. Augustine, I'm condensing that down, justified Christian wars for those two causes. And the Pope connects the need to save Jerusalem to those two by pointing out the oppression of the native Christians in Palestine under Muslim rule, and appealing to the feudal concept that Christ is the Lord of Lords and King of Kings, and his land, he is being held hostage. His castle, his home is being held hostage by people hostile to him who do not recognize him. And that is a feudal vassal's duty to ransom his lord. And he appeals to those, and he offers people spiritual rewards. He does not say that all their sins will be absolved. It is a very specific, and it's getting too deep into the weeds, but it's a common misperception that Christians were told that if they killed Muslims, that would get them to heaven. None of that's true. They could be absolved of certain sins to which they had already confessed and for which they'd already received absolution. Let's not get into the details. He combined three ideas. One, the concept of just war. Two, the concept of a feudal duty to your Lord. And third, the opportunity to gain spiritual grace by making an armed pilgrimage to Jerusalem and freeing Christ's homeland from the oppressors. And that sets off the First Crusade. The First Crusade is a very long, difficult thing. It's not the subject of this. You'll probably have someone else who talks about it. It was, 2,000 miles across some of it hostile territory. Only 1 out of 5 of the people who set out actually make it to Jerusalem. In the course of that, because you come to it later, you ask about the relations with Byzantium. The mixed relationship with Byzantium start during the First Crusade. Initially, as I say, but maybe we want to do that under Byzantium. Okay, maybe should I stop there? Have I answered your question, or do you think
you've answered most of it? We just need to get so just explain. So we've got why the First Crusade occurred. How did the Crusader states end up being established then?
Okay, then I'll go the one step further. So first of all, it's very important to understand that having gotten as far as Antioch, when they take the city of Antioch, which is essentially, as I said, has only been in Muslim hands for about 11 years. What did we just say? It is a Christian city, and they're actually let in by some of the defenders betray the city to the Crusaders. They get in, and the Muslim garrison falls back into the citadel. The city rejoices. They are liberated by the Crusaders. They're Orthodox Christians, but they see the Crusaders as their liberators. And when the crusading army defeats a relieving army, a much larger army from Mosul, comes and they go out and they defeat it, they go back into the city and they celebrate with the local natives and restore the Orthodox patriarch to his throne in Antioch.
Oh, wow.
At this point, they are also receiving aid from the Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem, who's in exile in Cyprus. He is sending the Crusaders food and supplies. The Orthodox Patriarch and the Pope and the Papal Legate are issuing joint communiques. This is a joint Orthodox Catholic undertaking. It is not a Catholic undertaking. It's a joint Orthodox Catholic undertaking.
I think a lot of people miss that, don't they? They think it's just a Catholic Latin thing, but it really wasn't.
And not at all. What's very important, what I'm going to do, when they then from Antioch, they go down the coast of the Levant. They do not fight their way down the coast of the Levant because the Muslim princes are very happy to make treaties with them, truces with them, truces, very careful. They could not make treaties, but they could make truces. And they gave them safe passage and even provided markets for them. On the motto of "Don't attack me, keep on going to Jerusalem," that's fine. That's another prince down there. Just don't attack me and you can buy a market. So all the way down the coast of the Levant, the crusading army advances by making truces with the Muslim powers. They get to Jerusalem, which is expecting them by this point. The Fatimid kingdom has taken Jerusalem in one of these 5 ships. Jerusalem at this point is being held by the Shia Fatimid kingdom. They have a strong Fatimid garrison. And having seen what happened in Antioch, that is, the Christian population helped the Crusaders, they now expel all of the Christians that are living in Jerusalem. And they try to defend Jerusalem with only the Jewish and Muslim population. The Crusaders are too weak to even surround the city. Not easy, but they do actually take the city by storm. And according to the laws of war since the time of the Trojan War onwards, if you take a city by storm, it is put to the sword. And that's what the Christians did. This was not the greatest scandal of all time. It was not horrible, as you would think. Most people, the casual, normal, popular view is this was one of the worst atrocities of history. No, historians estimate, based on Jewish and Muslim sources, historians estimate that only about 5,000 people were killed in the assault by the first Crusaders. That compared with, as I said, 26,500 under the Persians and more in other days. They do not slaughter all the Jews. We have Jewish records proving that many Jews survived and were ransomed. We have Muslim sources talking about ransom payments. And they'll note that later native Christian population wasn't even there. But they did take it by sea. The apocalyptic view of the Crusaders riding through blood to their horses' knees, which is physically impossible, comes from Christian sources, tragically, who are trying to show how apocryphal, how important this event was by exaggerating this great deed.
The literary special effects.
Yeah. So, but if we go back to the Arab and Jewish sources, as I say, it was an assault. There were people slaughtered in the streets, but it was a comparatively moderate one, and a lot of people survived and they got ransomed and all of that. And then you have this absurd situation. They fought for 3 years across all of Asia Minor. They've lost 4 out of 5 people. They pray in the Holy Sepulchre, and then it's like, oh, post-conflict resolution. Now what?
Yeah.
Nobody had thought, what are we going to do now that we freed Jerusalem? Probably because initially they thought the Byzantine emperor was going to lead them there, and the Byzantine emperor was simply going to retake Jerusalem. The Byzantine emperor didn't do that. For reasons of his own, he let the Crusaders go onward on their own. And by the time they reach Jerusalem, they are not willing to give to him something that they fought and died. So the leaders of the First Crusade, but most of whom want to go home, they pray to the Holy Sepulchre, they've done their job. Hey, they want to go home. They've been away from their wives and kids for 3 years. Their lands, are going fallow. They're in trouble. They want to go home. But if they go home, they know that all the area around Jerusalem, which is Muslim or controlled by Muslims, they want to come back to that point. That's a very important point. will fall again to the Muslim leadership, the Muslim armies. So a few of them, a very few of them, decide to remain. They think it was as little as 300 knights and maybe 2,000 foot soldiers that agree to remain in Jerusalem and try to hold it and try to create a sustainable state controlled by Christians, try to maintain Christian control so that other pilgrims, peaceful pilgrims, can come to Jerusalem. That said, the situation was nowhere near as dire as it sounds, because this is the most important point. The majority of the population in the what later became the Crusader states in Palestine, particularly around Jerusalem, were Christian.
So they didn't have like so they'd liberated a Christian population.
They were greeted in Bethlehem as liberators. They were greeted, of course, in Jerusalem, not because they'd expelled the Christian population.
The Fatimids had.
Yes. The majority of the population all around Jerusalem until 1915, incidentally, the Ottoman census, were Christian. And the Christians supported the Crusaders from the very start. Nevertheless, there's some pretty dramatic things. I mean, Godfrey goes out and defeats a Fatimid army is coming up. They've taken Jerusalem, but the main Fatimid army is coming up from Egypt. They leave Jerusalem with these pathetically not small number of troops, and they go and they surprise them at dawn when they're waking up before they say their prayers and slaughter that army. And then they go on in the next 10, 11 years, basically, they conquer the entire coastline, and they conquer the Galilee and Jordan, and they are expanding. How are they doing that? They're doing that mostly with native troops, and once they're there, knights are continuously coming out. Not just knights and foot soldiers are continuously coming out from the west. Many as pilgrims, many as armed pilgrims. So there's the flood of settlers starts almost immediately, but ultimately, from the beginning to the end, the armies of Jerusalem are composed predominantly of native Christians who support that state.
So it was an Orthodox Latin alliance that established the first Crusader states, and it was.
We often tend the feudal, because of the way Christian chronicles are. They always talk about the number of knights. They talk about the feudal host consisted of 300 Hospitallers, 300 Templars, and 85 from Nablus and 45 from Toron, or whatever the various baronies are. To a reader at that time, it was obvious that 45 knights means that you have at least 9 other people supporting them, because there's their squires, and they would always have an entourage. So you can say in a garrison, if they say it was defended by 10 knights, it wasn't defended by 10 knights. It was defended by 10 knights plus 90 other people.
Yeah.
The same thing is true when there's good studies now showing that for every knight there was a Turcopole practically. The mounted army of Jerusalem consisted of 2 branches, the heavy cavalry and the light cavalry. The light cavalry are mounted archers. The heavy cavalry are lancers. This is not so far from what was going on in the Napoleonic era with hussars and cuirassiers, but you've got those mounted archers are predominantly native Christians, because that's the kind of warfare they know. And they're using native horses, native horses, and the bow is their weapon. And the heavy armored knights are the Latin. But it's 50-50 at the top.
Brilliant. That's a fantastic answer. Really well done. Thank you. That was very clear. In terms of the Muslim and Jewish population that remained behind, firstly, I guess the first question would be, was there a Muslim Jewish population that was left behind after the establishment of the Crusader states? And if there was, could you explain what happened to them and what the life of Muslims and Jews were like living inside the kingdoms? Was there a level of tolerance that modern hearers might find surprising?
Yes, but let's go back to that. One thing that's very important is that when the Crusaders started conquering up the coast and going different places, they took one city after another. In most of those cases, they did not take it by storm. In most cases, they negotiated. And there would be fighting in advance. But at some point, when the city decided it had enough, they would normally negotiate that they could pull out. And what you have is that the Muslim elites, in other words, the Muslim, if you're a official, if you're a member of the army, you're of the administrative elite, if you're a very wealthy merchant in Muslim, you do not want to be in a Christian state because you become a second-class citizen. So every time as they expanded their territories, what happened is that the Muslim elites almost always withdrew and pulled back to other places, as you do. They would have family somewhere else. They go back. They'd start a new life in a Muslim controlled territory because they couldn't be an elite in a Christian country. The peasantry and the poor remained because they didn't have any place to go. They couldn't afford to leave. They didn't have the connections for leaving. And the bottom line is it didn't make all that much difference to their lives. So there was always a minority Muslim population in the Crusader states, both Shia and Sunni, and they were often at each other's throats, as you can imagine. And assassins also, they were all there. We have a wonderful report, and I probably can't find it that fast, but we can maybe find it if later if you want, of a Muslim traveler from Muslim Spain traveling through the Holy Land on his way to his Hajj to Mecca, and he passes through the Holy Land before Hattin in the last part of the 12th century, and complains bitterly that the Muslim peasants are better treated by their Christian lords.
Wow.
And that they trust the judgment of their Christian lords better than they. And he's outraged. He's condemning his fellows in the Muslim states, neighboring Muslim states, for mistreating their peasants. But the bottom line is he reports that they are better treated in the Christian states. That's sort of confirmed by the fact there is not a single instance of rebellion on the part of Muslims against their Christian rulers. Of course, you could say there were no rebellions by the Jews or the Christians against Muslim rulers as a whole. Spain is a bit different. I think you did have a rebellion there. I would also argue that
all of Eastern Europe, Cyprus, there was actually loads of rebellions, I think.
And there was a rebellion in Jerusalem itself against their Muslim lord. So that was Jewish primarily, a rebellion. But as far as I know, don't hold me to that one, please.
Fair enough.
I haven't studied it, but I know that there was one. The point is there was no massive rebellion. We also know that Christian lords allowed the Muslims, and this is really important, because under Sharia law, you cannot build houses of worship to any other religion than Islam. And in the Crusader states, both the Jews and the Muslims were allowed to build houses of worship. The Muslims were allowed to engage in the Hajj. There was tension because ultimately the local lord more or less decided how his peasants were treated. And you're going to have some that were better than others. But the bulk of them appear to have let their Muslim workers have their Fridays off, and Friday afternoon was a holiday instead of Sunday. They didn't care, just as long as the work gets done, kind of stuff. So on the whole, it is true that Muslims paid extra taxes. It is true that they could not be feudal lords. They were not trusted to fight in the armies. The Muslims were not part of the feudal armies. It was the native Christians. The Jewish situation is even more fascinating because the Jews had basically the same status as the Muslims. They really weren't trusted, and they did have extra taxes, but they could also build new synagogues. So the 400 years of Muslim rule, 450, no new synagogues come in. The Christians come in, the Franks come in. They are allowed to build new synagogues. What's fascinating to me is that during the Crusades, there's no question that anti-Semitism became much more rabid in the West, Western Europe. And in association with the Crusades, we know that for the First Crusade, the People's Crusade, there were massive atrocities along the Rhine against the Jewish citizens. So it's going to be a real shocker, I think, to most people to find that many of those Jews who were facing persecution and discrimination in Western Europe fled to the Crusader states.
Wow, that's a shock to me. Even I didn't know that.
Yeah, and this my sources for this, by the way, are the modern Israeli historians who've been looking at the great immigration to the Crusader states that occurred during the Crusader era, because during the Crusader era it became possible for Jews to go home.
Yes,
and they returned.
Yeah.
So there was a huge exodus. They're not only being persecuted, but now they have a way they can get on a ship and just pay a passage and go home. And they get there, and Accra by the 13th century, Accra has become one of the major centers of Talmudic studies in the world. It was a very vibrant intellectual community of Jews there. Jews also fled from Egypt to the Crusader states because it was considered such an open, tolerant, and vibrant Jewish, community. So yes, they were. Now I'm gonna take another little aside and say you will often read, no, that's not true. The Jews and the Christians were treated much better under the Muslims.
Caliphate, yeah.
Right. I like to refer you to the Egyptian Jewish historian Abat Yamor. You know her?
No, I don't. Go on, please.
Let me pull it up. Sorry. But can you see into this at all?
Yeah.
The decline of Eastern Christianity under Islam, from jihad to jimmitude. This book has hundreds of pages of documentation on how poorly the Jews were treated under Islam. It's it is stomach turning. She herself is an Egyptian Jew, and what her basic thesis is: the elites, many times the rabbis, the very educated, made pacts with their Muslim overlords and lived very well indeed, but at the price of the majority.
And a similar thing happened, obviously, in Islamic occupied Spain, where everyone thinks that there was this mythological paradise, and actually it was for a few intellectuals may have experienced that, but it definitely wasn't the shared experience of your average Jew or Christian in that period. That was absolutely fascinating. I didn't realize that Jews were making Aliyah, which is the return to Israel, during the Crusades. I did not realize that at all. That's really fascinating. A really fascinating point. So how did Christians, from the wider region, view the Crusader states and interact with them? I'm thinking, and you've kind of hinted at this, but maybe we can expand and unpack that answer a bit more. I'm thinking about Palestinians, Lebanese, Syrian Christians, Coptic Christians in Egypt, Armenian Christians. What was their sort of relation with
we have to distinguish. There's two aspects to that question. Okay. One is that, as a whole, the population, this was a period of flourishing for the Orthodox churches. The monasteries were built, churches were being built. The things that had been, rotting for 450 years were restored. Orthodox as well as Latin Christian, of course, the Latin churches were basically new. They were being built by the Latin orders and by the Latin leadership. But the Orthodox monasteries and convents and churches were being restored with monies partly from the crown and the Latin lords, but also from outside, because money started flooding in for them, etc. And the local populations, they lived side by side. When we talk about when the Christian lords, the settlers coming, they did not take the land away from the local people. They basically recovered land under the Muslim during the Muslim period. Palestine, the entire Levant, had become a backwater because the major centers were obviously Aleppo and Mosul and Baghdad and Cairo. And in fact, it had been a period of depopulation and desertification had been going on. The desert was literally reconquering much of the region. The land of milk and honey was being desertified because Muslim immigrants were, of course, herders and were just running their herds across, and they were not they weren't maintaining the irrigation ditches or any of that kind of thing. One of the major things, I don't want to get into that on the economy, is that the Franks invested in the infrastructure, which enabled them to bring more land under cultivation, and it meant they could increase returns. All of these things benefit everybody. What I'm trying to say is, if you're under Frankish rule, you have the native Christians had a very positive view. It doesn't mean they got along with everybody, but they're also intermarrying with one another. I'd like to read a couple things. One is that the while the Latin and the Orthodox hierarchies engaged in some squabbling about who gets what tithes, on the whole, the relations between the churches, let alone between the peoples, was good. And we have a quote, I have a quote here from the Jacobite patriarch Michael the Great, who wrote in the second 12th half of the 12th century that the Franks never sought a single formula for all of the Christian people and languages. They considered as Christian anyone who worshiped the cross without investigation or examination. There was no discrimination against the other Christians, whether they were Armenian, Coptic, Syrian, it didn't matter. And they were an awful lot. They were fighting among themselves. The Jacobites and the blanking out, but Melkites, I think, were always fighting with each other. But they recognized the Franks. They were Christian. They were treated as Christian. Now, that does not mean that the Christian Crusader states, as political entities, did not actually have border disputes with the Armenians and didn't invade Fatimid Egypt 6 times. So, and when they're invading Fatimid Egypt, the question of whose side were the Christians in Egypt on, I don't know. There's a lot of evidence that many of the Christians were actually loyal to their Fatimid lords for whatever reasons. But though it's what I'm trying to distinguish. Do you want to talk about church relations? Do you want to talk about human relations? Do you want to talk political relations?
Okay, I get that it's a much stronger. Maybe the question was too broad in scope. Let's talk about in terms of you mentioned, for instance, that there was some conflict with the Armenian kingdom. Was that also an independent state at this time? What was the relationship politically right?
Between Armenia, well, it had been part of the Byzantine Empire, and in the 13th century, it actually becomes it's a principality in its own right, and they're intermarrying with the Crusader kingdoms. A number of Armenian princesses that are queens in Cyprus and elsewhere. And of course, the very first queen of Jerusalem was Armenian. She was the wife of Baldwin II. So that's why I want to get back. You look at human relations, those Crusaders who stayed behind were, 99.9% male. If they stayed and settled there, they married local girls, and those local girls were Orthodox Christians. Yeah. And their children had both traditions. And they were called Franks because they were Latins, and normally they followed the Latin rule. But one of my favorite stories, which you may not like, is that when there's a fight in the struggle between the barons of Outremer and the Pope and Frederick II Hohenstaufen, there's one stage when the Pope, who actually later, of course, excommunicates Frederick Hohenstaufen at least 3 times and actually calls a crusade against him. But there was a period when he was on Frederick's side and tries to excommunicate the barons who are fighting him. And he does. He not only excommunicates the barons, particularly John de Evelyn, the Lord of Beirut, and his sons and brothers and everyone. He issues an interdict in the city of Accra. So, and what do the citizens of Accra do, who support the barons and the rebels against the authoritarian Frederick? They go to the Orthodox churches. They don't care.
Yeah.
And the Pope immediately. So that close relationship, the second, third generation in Outremer, even if they were Latin Christians, normally spoke Arabic, often spoke Greek. The Evelyn spoke Latin, Greek, Arabic, as I say, as well as French. That's what this society was. It became very multicultural and very polyglot. And
so it wasn't by any means just these knuckle-dragging thugs, as Western modern pop culture likes to present it. This was quite a sophisticated society.
Extremely. I mean, just the opposite. It was the barons of Outremer become legal scholars in the 13th century. Their works, they write history books, legals and legal treatises are considered some of the most sophisticated writing of the entire 13th century, regardless of where. The libraries of Antioch, one of the most important things, when the Crusaders came in, they did not sack and burn, not libraries. The Mongols did that. the Crusaders actually preserved the library, particularly the library at Antioch, I'm remembering, because it was a center for medical studies. They preserved that, and Antioch became a major center for medical research and thought because of this huge library going back to ancient Greek time, but also because scholars from the Arab and the Turkish and the, Iberian and the Jewish and the Byzantine and the Christian Latin were on the, from all over the world coming to Antioch to study there, and they were exchanging ideas. The barons, as I say, of Outremer, who opposed Frederick Hohenstaufen, did so on the basis of constitutional law. And they were very noted scholars. They were also, some of them were poets, historians, and other things. One of the barons of Ibelin was famous for translating Arab love poetry into French. One of the leading scholars of Outremer, William Tyre, the Archbishop of Tyre, wrote a history of Islam based using Arabic sources.
Wow. See, this is exactly why I wanted to speak to someone of your learning, because none of this has made it into the common discourse about the Crusader states. The common discourse about the Crusader states is completely lacking in nuance, completely lacking in the full spectrum, dynamism, or the full color of these states. And
which is why I wrote the book, was because what we have almost half a century of scholarship which refutes the standard view, the kingdom of heaven view of the evil crusaders, the barbaric crusaders, and the enlightened local Muslim community, and the genocidal and the what we were talking about in your introduction, the genocidal and proto-colonial nature of the Crusader states, which is based on, it's historians, we are to blame. It was historians of the 18th and 19th century and early 20th century that developed that model and wrote that. And that's what still dominates popular culture. What happened was that in the second half of the 20th century, in the early 21st century, archaeologists started refuting some of the major, with stone, stone, and data mining brought absolute hard evidence that refuted many of these theses that had been so adopted and accepted and had become popular. And so the point of my book was to pull together the research that's been done in everything as far away as medical research, medical history, because now with modern technology, they can dig up crusaders and look at what kind of medical treatment they had and say, oh, wow, the medical treatment the Crusaders got wasn't worse than what the Muslims were getting. In fact, they're doing brain surgery. Why? Look at this. These people have done, there's some amazing things coming out of this. And the same thing was true as the old trope is that the Crusaders were afraid of their own population, which of course were all Muslim. No, because besides data mining proves that most of the people were Christian, or a majority were Christian. And two, they didn't live in castles. They didn't have to, and they didn't live in cities. We have all these farms where the population is living next to each other and sharing the church.
Amen. That's amazing. So and I do want to encourage people to go out and buy this book. If you have you got it with you? Do you want to just maybe show it so people can see the cover? Like if you haven't got it, I want to encourage. Yeah. The Holy Land in the Year of the Crusades. Yeah, we can see that. Just lift it up a bit more. There you go. That's the full cover. Yeah, you've got it. Brilliant. So go out and get this book, guys. It really is a fantastic refutation of lots of the modern myths about the crusading states. But I just want to focus in more on the topic because we're pacing well, given the questions. Obviously, because of the nature of the academic interview, you've seen the questions in advance because we want you to be as prepared as possible for the answers, so that the interview is informative. And we're pacing well against the time versus where we are in the interview. But we need to keep on track, otherwise we're going to be going over our allotted time space. So tell us then, how did these Crusader states sustain themselves economically, considering the fact of their socioeconomic and political position in the region, sort of like on the outskirts of the Latin, beyond the logistical scope, or on the edge of the logistical scope of the Latin kingdoms You know, how did they sustain themselves economically in this time?
Oh, they were the richest. I mean, they're notorious for being, wealthy, and that's what saved them. Actually, a lot of the time in the 13th century, they were so wealthy. They are the entrepot. I call it kingdoms at the crossroads of civilizations, because these are where the trade routes come together, and the ports of the Levant become the main transshipment points for all the goods coming all the way from India and China. There's Chinese porcelain from this period in the
Oh,
Crusader
wow.
states.
Yeah.
There's Indian spices, there's gold from Nubia, there's ivory from deeper in Africa, there's obviously Arabian products and Byzantine products. All of them are being loaded and transshipped and going to Western Europe, which is booming economically, and buying these luxury goods. In addition, I come back to that, what I said about the agriculture. The Crusader state, the Franks, the Crusaders were called, the people who stayed in Latin, the Latin Christians were called Franks. Let me say this. This is not like in Franks as in France. It is not Franks as it was a term that was used at the time to mean basically all Latin Christians living in this area. And so you'll hear me use that. They invested, the Frankish kingdom invested heavily in infrastructure, as I said, including aqueducts, sewage systems, by the way. That's sort of not relevant so much to your question of economics, but useful information. But aqueducts, irrigation, terracing, mills, and roads. And that meant that they had a huge agricultural revival, which of course is a major source of wealth in the medieval period. Okay, so the agriculture is doing very well in this region. They also they invested and started up agricultural processing. So they had wine production, olive oil production, and most importantly, they went to industrial scale sugar production. Huge, big money making thing, very, very lucrative, selling that in the East. You see this pattern repeated when they take Cyprus at the end of the Third Crusade, and Cyprus became a major producer of export of sugar and wine, and other things too, salt and other things. Then the industry, they're under the Frankish, in the Frankish period, industry, there was there was important and very lucrative industries were glass production. The Venetians, the fame of Venice as a glassmaker actually comes because of their ties to the Crusader states, and they took the methods back with them to Venice. But glass was being produced, particularly in Accra and Tyre, I know. Textiles, particularly silk and cyclatan. Cyclatan means Latin silk, the silk produced by the Latins. It is a weft or one or the other, of gold, pure gold and silk.
Oh, wow. Amazing.
They also did they were very famous for hybrids where they mixed silk with wool and cotton. They produced wool from not just sheep, but goats and camel hair. Anyways, there were a variety of textile products, and particularly the silk product, which of course was very lucrative business, produced in the Crusader states. So shikar, silk. What else did I have here? Oh, my favorite topic. They were very famous for the production of books, mass production of books, illustrated books, and icons.
Wow.
And those were produced in workshops en masse as low level. So if you're the Queen of Jerusalem, you of course commission your Bible, and it's individually prepared, and it has jewels and ivory and there are illustrations on every page, and it's unaffordable. But if you're Joe Doe pilgrim from Durham, England, you go to the Holy Land, you can't afford all that, but you still want to take something home. And one thing to take home is maybe a book of the Gospels, or maybe the whole Bible, or maybe just your favorite Psalms or whatever. And you could buy those in Jerusalem, already finished, without illustrations. So they weren't that expensive. So they mass-produced books for the tourist market. And they also mass-produced icons, which again sounds a little contradictory, but it's the same thing. If you want an individual icon which shows, you and your husband doing homage to your favorite saint in a certain environment, that's going to cost you a lot. But if you just want Saint George killing the dragon, or you want Mary and Jesus, you could get those in the Crusader states, initially in Jerusalem, later more in Accra, from workshops that had, scores of people just painting from, sort of painting by numbers, painting what was already been done by somebody else.
Wow.
And you could sell those. So those were two, again, extremely lucrative businesses in the Crusader state. All of this is pointing to the fact that one of the major sources of income for the Crusader states was religious tourism.
Yeah.
There were tens of thousands of pilgrims going to Jerusalem every single year. They came in two waves. They came in the spring and they came in the fall because of the storms in the storms in the winter and frankly Stillwater in the summer. But there were these big wave of pilgrims would come in the spring with this, and then most of the pilgrims would stay through the summer, visiting all the various sites, and then go home with the fall fleet, so to speak. Or maybe they'd stay a year or two sometimes, or maybe they'd stay forever. But all of those tourists, they had to have housing, they had to have food, they had to have transport, they wanted souvenirs, they needed guides, sometimes they needed guards. I mean, there was, as with any major, massive tourist industry, this was a major source of income to the Crusader states.
And did the Crusaders, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, Dr. Schrader. Did the Crusader states also trade with their Muslim neighbors, their Muslim kingdom neighbors?
That was their main source. I mean, that I was just going to say. But ultimately, their main source of wealth was that trade, which was coming, as I say, all the way from China, but coming across that what do we call it? What is it? The Silk Road. They're coming out of China, they're coming out of India, they're coming up from Arabia, and they're coming into Accra and Beirut and Tyre, and the ships are coming up, across from all of Europe, Western Europe, mostly the Italian city-states, the Italian maritime powers are a lot of it are controlling these. And all of those merchants bringing the caravans coming up from Arabia and coming up from Axum, my lovely, from Ethiopia, and coming up across from India, they're paying taxes, they're paying duties, they're paying at every gate, at every market along the way, they're paying. And that was why in the first half of the 13th century, after Saladin had almost taken the entire kingdom, and it partially recovers during the Third Crusade. It's very weak, and it's dependent largely on Cyprus for food now. It no longer has that agricultural base in the 13th century. But the Ayyubid princes, Saladin's successors, were making so much money from trade to the Crusader states that they just did one truce after another. So every time the 6-year truce or the 10-year truce expired, they do another. There might be a little hiccup of status, here a little, what do we say, raiding here or there, or what, a little state of fighting. But basically, they go back because it was just too lucrative. And the Ayyubid princes they loved their luxury lifestyle. And then meanwhile, the Crusader states had this reputation of being Cyprus, the barons of Cyprus were known as being so luxury loving. And of course, the insults about preferring bath to battle, and there was always a sense that the Crusaders, the Franks and the Crusader states were so rich, so luxury loving, that they weren't any good for fighting anymore. There was a certain resentment and jealousy on the part of Westerners coming there. But the bottom line is they were making fortunes. They claim that the income, I could find the source for you, but before we waste time looking for it, there is a source that says that the income of the city of Accra alone was more than the entire kingdom of England.
Wow, that's incredible. That's really incredible.
That was in the early 13th century.
Yeah. So in terms of that's given a really interesting view on its economy. What role, if any, did the religious fighting orders like the Templars, the Hospitallers, and other religious fighting orders play in these kingdoms?
Keep in mind that the Templars were founded, of course, only 1130 something. Yeah, 32, whatever, which means 30 years after the kingdom of Jerusalem is found. And then they do become very popular and very strong. But in the first kingdom of Jerusalem, you can say that their role was ancillary. You could pretty much say that the Templars were increasingly strong, useful, But in the Second Kingdom of Jerusalem, in the 13th century, when the hinterland has been lost, when you basically just have the cities, the coastline under Christian control, and Cyprus, the defense of the kingdom almost entirely reverted to the militant orders. It was their castles and it was their garrisons, and it was actually their troops at like La Forby, which are doing the main part of the fighting, because the barons have lost the land holdings. They no longer have. So you have a lot of the barons. They still go around calling themselves the Count of Jaffa, etc. But they may actually live in Jaffa, but they don't have the hinterland and the wealth necessary, or the manpower. I think is more important than the wealth. They were wealthy, but they didn't have the manpower for the defense. And the militant orders drew their manpower from all of Western Europe, so they were able to keep garrisons in the castles. The main problem is that even a place like Cap Chevalier, the most these iconic Crusader castles, required massive numbers of people. If you have concentric circles of outer walls and you have multiple towers, they all need men. The most perfect castle in the world with no people in it is indefensible.
Mm.
And the barons didn't have the manpower to keep up the garrison, so they basically, you have even the Lord of Tripoli start selling off his castles even towards the end of the 12th century. So that was one thing that the militant orders were very important for, as I say, predominantly in the 13th century. The other thing I really want to emphasize is the Hospitallers invented or reinvented or introduced the concept of hospitals to the West. Hospitals actually evolved in Byzantium, in the Byzantine Empire, and then they were imitated in the Arab world. And when the first Crusaders came to the Levant, the Arabs already had extremely sophisticated teaching hospitals, experimental hospitals, extremely high quality medical care. It was based on the same theories, as I say. Now we've got some more interesting, that they weren't necessarily using different therapies or approaches to problems so much as they had institutionalized care in a way that had not been done in the West. Medicine in the West was still largely in the hands of monasteries and at home, and people were simply given spiritual care, but they were not given specialist care by trained professionals. And that changes as a result of the exposure. The hospitals, of course, was established actually before the First Crusade. And as they evolve, they take that concept of providing medical care in institutions back to the West, and they establish hospitals in the West. Amazing story. The Hospitallers used doctors regardless of their religion, and they gave aid to anyone regardless of their religion. When they went onto a battlefield, they took everyone. They did not just pick up the Christians. They vowed to treat their patients as their lords, and they dedicated themselves to the holy poor. I personally think there's no institution more Christian in my understanding of the word than the Hospitallers in this period.
Amazing.
They did not really start becoming fighting men until more into the 13th century.
And that was out of necessity, wasn't it? In terms of
that was because they had these large institutions and they wanted to protect them partially. So initially they had secular knights who were providing the protection, and then they wanted to take vows, and it was a battle within the institution. By the way, there was a lot of resistance to it. There were people in the hospital who did not want to militarize, and there were those who wanted to militarize to compete with the Templars. As anything, there's always personalities and various factions and issues. But the Hospitallers also think, well, I don't know if you'll come to it later, they realized that the trauma of being taken slave, because what happens, the men get killed and the women are taken into slavery, the trauma of slavery and the people when they were released, it was the hospitals that started setting up basic hospitals to deal with people with mental problems as well. And took them back and would reintegrate them into society and would give those released from captivity money to start a new life.
Wow, that's beautiful. That's really beautiful. And the Hospitallers, they're still around. They're one of one of Europe's oldest institutions.
Well, the Knights of
Um,
St. John, I mean, they've sort of broken down into a number of institutions, but
yeah.
most of them are still very much, yeah, okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Fighting
There's a knight living in a castle in Malta. I didn't see him personally, but I saw his castle and I waved. Um, my personal favorite is the Templars. Were just briefly, were these orders an effective fighting force?
Oh yeah, I mean, they reintroduced the idea of discipline. um,
Go on.
I don't want to exaggerate that because the one of the things you see is that the armies of Outremer generally, the Crusader states, were very disciplined armies, extremely disciplined armies. In contrast to the armies in Western Europe, which tend to be much smaller, and there are reasons for that. There's a whole chapter on why these tactics evolve. But if you're in Western Europe, you're dealing with basically lots of hills and forests and a small troop can quickly go out and do a little bit of damage. In the wide open spaces of the East, large armies, tens of thousands of people being fielded, you couldn't have a lot of little troops under individual lords. You had to be more disciplined. And the armies, the Crusaders, the Franks, recognize, I mean, they evolve very rapidly. Self-defense, is the mother of the need to
Necessity, yeah.
counter the tactics of your enemy makes you much more inventive. So they learned how to what am I the fighting box is they would put the horses and the knights in the middle and surround them by the infantry with shields, and they could move that. They could either stand still or they could move, which is what Richard the Lionheart did all the way down the Third Crusade, taking their dead and their wounded with them. And when it was ready, the infantry opened and the cavalry could go out and do a very short charge and as necessary. And it was a very, very effective tactic, but it required a huge amount of discipline. And they did that. But yes, the Knights Hospitaller and the Templars were very effective fighting forces because generally they had high levels of discipline, high levels of training, and they had sufficient resources to make sure that everyone had basically the same quality of equipment. One of the biggest problems with medieval armies, if you're calling up troops, is that some people richer than others, some people can't afford much, or they don't maintain it, or whatever. And so you say I call up my 100 guys, and maybe only 10 of them really have fighting kit that's worth taking onto a battlefield.
Yeah.
That's a problem with feudal armies. Whereas the Templars and the Hospitallers, because of their massive resources, could make sure that they're at the cutting edge in the Holy Land where they're fighting. They had their best troops, they had their best equipment, their best horses, etc.
Right, brilliant. So how did the Crusader states get on with the Byzantine Empire at different periods? Because we touched on that, and
that's a complex. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess an auxiliary question to that is why wasn't there more coordination and cooperation between the Byzantine Empire and the Crusader states? So take whichever one of those two you want to, and then I'll throw the other one back in this.
This is a really complicated issue because you have to realize that the Byzantine Empire thought that it all belonged to them. And the Crusaders, as I said, thinking that they had fought and died so far, didn't recognize Byzantine suzerainty. So that's one issue. There were periods of cooperation, but there were more periods of tension. And I guess I don't have an easy answer for that. I'm gonna almost pass that about because it's really hard to get in. You go back and look at some of the Byzantine attitudes were very arrogant. I mean, there are some quotes that are just appalling. That they're barbarians and the Byzantines were very, very arrogant. They didn't help the Crusaders when they needed it at Antioch. They were constantly trying to get control of Antioch afterwards. There was a brief period under Manuel the First, when, of course, it doesn't help that Reynard de Chatillon then goes and attacks Cyprus and rapes and pillages and burns a perfectly Christian island. Yes, those kind of things, of course, exasperated things. But then they patched up and they worked together on trying to conquer Egypt, which had also been part of the Byzantine Empire. So they wanted to see Egypt restored. But when after Manuel dies and the Andronicus comes in, they end up doing a peace. They end up having a peace treaty with Saladin, and they probably agreed to try, at least to try to stop any crusaders from coming through, which means they did provide no assistance to Frederick Barbarossa when he was coming in on the Third Crusade. Theirs was a perception in the Latin kingdoms that they basically destroyed, ruined Barbarossa's campaign, which made it much harder for them to have enough troops to regain the kingdom. And yet the bottom line is that the mercenary operation led by Venice, which captured Constantinople in 1204, was basically a Venetian affair. It was not supported by the Crusader states because the troops that went to Venice should have come to the Crusader states. They were resentful of the diversion to Zara and Constantinople. The Venetian, the Doge who led the attack on Constantinople in 1204, had lost relatives in massacres in Constantinople. The Byzantines had twice massacred the Latin population, based more or less the commercial population of Genoa and Venice, in brutal massacres where they, tore the priests out of their churches, and
wow,
it's really ugly, really horrible descriptions. And this was just mob violence in Constantinople, and the Venetian Doge was out for revenge, and he got it all right, but obviously using Alexis as an excuse.
Is it right that the Fourth Crusaders were excommunicated by the Pope?
Yes, they were excommunicated before they even went. They were excommunicated for trying to attack Zara, let alone for going against Constantinople.
Yeah.
That's why I don't call it a crusade, because it's not a crusade. If a crusade, we have these numbered crusades. They were numbered hundreds of years after the event. In the medieval period, they didn't use the term crusade, and they certainly didn't number some expeditions and not others. There were all sorts of armed expeditions that we didn't number. And then you have two armed expeditions. We have the Fourth Crusade, which no one at the time considered a crusade because the Pope had condemned it and excommunicated the leaders. And Frederick II's campaign to Jerusalem he was excommunicated at the time, and the Pope called it an anti-crusade, and
Right. So it's wrong really to call the Fourth Crusade the Fourth Crusade. It's just a Venetian.
It was a Venetian,
apostasy.
Mercenary. It was a mercenary attack on, the Venetians hired these Latin knights to go and do their business for them. Very successful.
And was there ever a moment in which Byzantine and Crusader state armies marched together? In
all the invasions of Egypt. I mean, you want the dates on the invasions of Egypt? There was that whole period when Manuel I was emperor, and Almaric was king of Jerusalem, and they together took on Egypt. So let me see. Let's see. First invasion of Egypt, 1163. Second invasion, 1164. Third invasion, 1167. Fourth invasion, 1168-69, and then Saladin becomes vizier, and Saladin's, so that was it. And Almaric visits Constantinople in 1171 and possibly does homage to Manuel at that time. That was when he was married to Maria Ximena, one of Manuel's great nieces, and his brother had also been married to a Byzantine princess. So, as I say, in the period from about 1150 to the fall till Manuel's death, which is 1183 or something, 1182. There was about 30 years when they were cooperated very closely.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I'm finding this absolutely fascinating, Dr. Helena. It really is. I mean, you've already blown my mind with a whole bunch of stuff that I wasn't aware of, and I thought myself quite well read on the Crusades, and Clearly, there's so much that I did not
There's
know.
more.
Yeah, so much I did not know. So tell us about the significance of the Holy Land and the Crusader kingdoms to the rest of Christian Europe, both
I
East
think
and
that
West.
I'm going to say this, and I think I covered that at the beginning. It's
Okay,
essentially Christ was born and died in Jerusalem and rose from the dead, if you're a Christian,
but
in
does the
Jerusalem.
did the existence of the Crusader kingdoms take on any kind of apocalyptic metaphor, or did they were they seen as any kind of fulfillment of prophecy, or was it just like, oh, well, it's great, we've got some Christian kingdoms, like
No, the key. I don't know about prophecy and all of that. I'm going to just say that I don't think it was seen as I've never seen that. Okay,
okay, yeah,
maybe
yeah,
that's
yeah, no,
because my
I'm asking
okay,
genuinely. So
but
it was just the
what
fact
I
that it
have
was.
seen is the sense of it is our Christian duty to keep Christ's land, his homeland, in Christian hands, and it was profoundly felt. I mean, when Urban gives when you make this appeal at Claremont, he thought he was asking for fighting men. Instead, old ladies and nuns and priests and everybody wants to go to Jerusalem, and it's like, no, wait, stop. It's in Muslim hands. I'm trying to raise an army, but everybody he released but a well of emotion that is hard to understand in today's terms. But people genuinely felt it was, I'm not even going to say it was their duty. They felt a desire, a burning desire to go to Jerusalem, to go to the Holy Sepulchre,
Mm.
to go there, to be there, to
and
stand
they
there,
and,
to
and they
die
saw
there, to be
and they saw
buried there.
themselves going on pilgrimage, didn't they did.
It was absolutely. This was, as I say, they sometimes call it an armed pilgrimage because you had to defend, you had to fight your way there. But it was pilgrimage, and the all of the spiritual benefits were not, as I said, were not for killing people. It was not for. It was for going to Jerusalem.
Mm. Yeah.
And as I said, the Pope was amazed and sort of surprised by the well of emotion that he unleashed. And there was a sense that when against all the odds they actually succeed in taking Jerusalem, that's why you have, as say, these accounts, these apocryphal accounts of this is amazing, this is God's will, this is very much, this God's will almost comes retroactive. After they win it, we'll see it must have been God's will because we did it, we
Yeah.
succeeded. And then comes the Second Crusade and they fail miserably, and it's all of a sudden, oops. Well, then we have to find an explanation. Why did they fail in the second? It must have been because they were so sinful.
Mm.
The first Crusaders were good. If you look at them objectively, the first Crusaders were probably much more brutal, self-interested people than Louis VII or whatever. But
Yeah.
there was this perception of we have to find excuses, or God is testing us, or then you start getting all these theological arguments about why would we lose if it's
Mm.
God's will, etc. But
Yeah.
the first crusade just seemed to awake a latent desire to go back to Christ's homeland, and then the success of the first crusade reinforced that this is what we should do. And people, tens of thousands of people, I mean, these are common people selling practically everything they have just to go to Jerusalem and back.
Did the Crusades do anything? Did the Crusade that links to the Crusader kingdoms do anything to the European kingdoms in terms of their economy? I mean, I imagine it's obviously changing their spirituality. Um, did it expose? Did it expose them to
Well,
new kinds of
I've
learning?
talked about there's all sorts of technology that comes back, the technology, glassmaking technology, surcoats come back, concentric castles. Edward the First's great castles are basically Crusader castles. The sugar trade trade is booming. The Italians, city states, the Renaissance. I mean,
Yeah.
I've made that argument. In fact, I'm not the first. There's some 19th century historians who also play the game of saying the Renaissance is the product of the Crusades because it was
Mm.
the contact with these other worlds and these and trade, the wealth of the Italian states and the contact with the Byzantium and with the East, including China, Marco Polo, which enabled the Renaissance. So there's all those kinds of things. I talk about hospitals, and I say hospitals
Mm.
baths. After the contact with the public baths in the East, bathing became very, very popular all across Western Europe. The Black Prince had hot and cold running water in his palaces. So, you know,
Yeah.
they didn't have that in the 5th century, all right, but they did in the 12th century and the 13th century because of the exposure to the bathing culture in the East. As the cities in the East had, massive sewage systems that the individual houses could connect to.
Yeah.
Um, that was not as successful in the West, but I mean, the exposure was there, the understanding of it, all of these things.
Mm. It
Of
sounds
course, they
like
had,
it.
yeah,
So it had a transformative effect upon Europe.
yeah,
But let's go on.
particularly because of those pilgrims. Let me come back to those are peaceful pilgrims. When I'm talking about, forget the Crusaders, tens of thousands of ordinary people peacefully getting on boats and traveling to Jerusalem and back, or to the Levant, or to Israel, what's now Israel and back, Palestine and back, every single year. And those people are seeing different cultures, different, you know, technologies, clothes, they're eating different foods. It's the experience of travel that we try to get now, but in a way that was much more transformative, because up to that point, they lived in their little villages, right? If
Mm.
they went on pilgrimage, they went to Canterbury, maybe they went to Santiago de Compostela, but suddenly they're going to Jerusalem and Bethlehem and Nazareth.
Yeah.
I think there needs to be a lot more study of how that impacted attitudes in Europe.
Yeah. That
Uh,
would be fascinating. Really would.
and one of my favorite ones, if I may add this,
Yeah,
we have
please.
time.
Yes, yes, yes,
There's
yes.
a connection. Simon de Montfort, I know he's very controversial in England now, but basically he was a parliamentary reformer. He did expand the franchise, the House of Commons, and he is the first cousin of one of the leading lords of Outremer, who he spent time with during the Barons' Crusade. And that cousin had been the leader of the revolt, or the son of the leader of the revolt against Frederick II.
Mm.
These are parliamentary and constitutional ideas that were coming out of the East, because the entire revolt against Frederick was a revolt in favor of rule of law and against the arbitrary disseizement of fiefs and insistence on the right to trial before your peers. They're fundamental principles of British law now, but they were experimented with. They were basically being advocated in Outremer before Simon de Montfort came out.
And Outremer, for those that don't know, is another reference to Crusader states.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, no,
Landsman.
no. Yes, I'm just thinking of the
Yeah,
uninitiated.
yeah, yeah. So the Simon de Montfort's brother, the Simon de Montfort the elder, his brother marries an Evelyn, and his son is then, when his wife dies, he brings his son back, and that son is raised by his sister-in-law. In other words, he grew up with Simon de Montfort. Philip de Montfort and Simon de Montfort, the Earl of Leicester, grew up together in the same household in the south of France, and then crusade together. And it's that Philip de Montfort is related to the Bailey and the Evelyn, as I say, who was part of this revolt in Outremer.
Mm.
And after that, Leicester returns to England and becomes the leader of the parliamentary reform movement.
Oh wow! So there you go, guys. There you go. That's quite a link itself. So returning back to the Outremer kingdoms, the Crusader states. Did they ever forge alliances
Oh yeah, with what, Muslims?
With Muslim fiefdoms, Muslim
Oh
kingdoms
yes,
against other Muslims?
yes, they did. And that's a point of tension, because, for example, during the Second Crusade, they actually had an alliance with Damascus against Zengi, who was the lord of Aleppo. And the Crusaders decided they wanted to attack Damascus, and it was like, but we have peace.
Yeah.
and it was like the Crusaders, as I say, is distinct from the residents of Outremer, always had a hard time understanding that the residents of Outremer were constantly involved in tactical alliances, and they used this to stay alive. They would ally with one of the or the other of the particularly the Ayyubid princes in the early 13th century, who were always squabbling with one another. actually the Arab states were almost always squabbling with one another. It was only under very, very strong leaders like Saladin that they didn't. And even Saladin spent most of his life fighting other Sunni Muslims. After taking Fatima and England, he fought against Mosul, he fought against Aleppo. They were almost always fighting with each other, and the Crusaders used that, or the Crusader states, the Franks and the Crusader states, used that very, very effectively to keep themselves alive. And that's, I think, one of the later questions is why did they fall? One of the key issues is that the Ayyubid princes are lost one after another to the Mamluks. The Mamluks murder. If you don't know the story, there's a dramatic Louis the Ninth is a prisoner on a boat in the middle of the Nile, and the Ayyubid Sultan comes down and is murdered by his own Mamluk guards in front of Louis. And they actually wade out to Louis and offer the heart of the dead Sultan to him. He turns it down. The Mamluks.
Okay, didn't know that.
Yeah. It's real first-hand account. The point is the Mamluks are slave soldiers who are fanatical Muslims, and but they're outsiders. They don't have a legitimacy, and they gain their legitimacy by being fanatical Muslims. In other words, they take jihad as a means of legitimacy. It's the same way that Saladin may have only been a jihadist because he was a Kurd and also a usurper, and he used that religious jihadism to gain legitimacy. But the thing is, they were willing to sacrifice the goose that laid the golden egg. As long as the Ayyubid princes are making so much money from the trade going through the Crusader states, they didn't really want to wipe them out. It was not in their economic interests to destroy the Crusader states, because they knew that if they did, that source of income would actually dry up, because merchants weren't going to trade with them in the same way they traded with Christians. The Mamluks come in, they don't care about that. They're willing to literally just destroy cities and leave them, let them go to waste. Saladin wanted it all. He thought he could capture those cities but he didn't want to destroy them. The Mamluks literally leave behind a wasteland. And that's why the whole region goes into decline and becomes a backwater again. So one of the things that destroyed the Crusader states was that with the rise of the Mamluks, they didn't have partners with whom they could negotiate, with whom they could trade, and with whom they could play they couldn't play them off against one another so effectively. The Mongols is another factor. The Mongols have swept in and are, the Mamluks, actually, it's the Mamluk army that stops the Mongols. The Crusaders don't.
I think we're just slightly veering into the final question, which is, why did the Crusader kingdoms
I thought
fail?
that's all right.
Yeah,
sorry.
I just want to sort of bring it back to the way that Christians allied with Muslims in this period. For instance, did they ever sort of play off the Shia Sunni rivalry and sort of try to capitalize on that, or was it really just like this baron hates this baron who they're both Muslims, so we'll side with this baron because this is convenient at this moment in time?
It was more that it was, as I say, it was the princes. It was not normally it was the Sultan of Damascus getting the Sultan of Cairo, who was by this time were all Sunni. In other words, Saladin destroys the Fatimid Caliphate, and after that, they're all Sunni Muslims. They're all Sunnis. They're Shias, but the rulers are all Sunni beyond after that.
Yeah.
And the Crusaders, the very first crusade, when they were first coming, the Fatimid regime in Cairo thought that they were just going to attack the Turks and said, "Oh, hey, this is great, we'll help you." And the Crusades, "No, we're going to Jerusalem." And that was, wait a minute, Jerusalem's ours.
Yeah.
But there's some interesting exchanges where the Fatimids were still trying to convince the Crusaders to fight with them against the Seljuks, and it hadn't quite caught on to the fact that these people were different from normal mercenaries.
Yeah.
But no, as I say, the Fatimids were in Egypt, and they didn't really play.
What about the Crusader? What about the Crusader? Sorry, go on.
I just remembered. I'm sorry. In Egypt itself, I mean, that was the whole thing. When all of those invasions of Egypt, except for one, they were allying themselves with one of the factions in Egypt. They were actually allying themselves with the Fatimids in Egypt against the Damascus,
Right.
against Radin. So, but it's really complex because they were different viziers were fighting with each other and assassinating each other. I'd have to go back to get you the exact details, but there's they did at that point support, but they didn't do it because they were Shia. They were doing it because that person was willing to pay them or was inviting them in, and they saw it as an opportunity to get their foothold in Egypt.
Right. And what about with the Mongols? Like the Mongols were coming in. Why
They
didn't
were
the Crusader states unite with the Mongols and fight,
because
or did they?
because the Mongol. Oh, I wish I had that quote. Let me see if I can find it. The Mongols said, "We will conquer you because we can, and we'll kill you."
So basically, there was
The
no point.
Mongols had no interest in they were really totally if I can find that
Nihilistic.
nihilistic. Yeah.
Yeah. Take a moment if you want to find that quote. It'd be interesting if we
Okay.
can get it, but don't worry if you can't. I'll take your best memory version of it, and we'll
I'm trying.
you
It
know.
must have been Mongols. Yeah.
Just whilst you're finding that, I think it's a very interesting thing that we've got this example of a muscular Christianity. We've got an example of a muscular Christian state, but it isn't, a deeply religious Christian state. But it isn't how modernists try to characterize such a state as being ignorant, backward, intolerant, suppressive of economy, suppressive of science and technology. I think the interview with Dr. Schrader has demonstrated actually that deep religious conviction and devotion can go hand in hand with complex diplomatics, use and advancements in science and learning, uh, successful economy, even tolerance of religious difference, and yeah, I think there's a lot that people can take away from this, and should do. So, have you found your quote?
I did. It's
That's as much water treading as I can do.
the Mongols were unlike any previous invader in that they flatly rejected compromise and peace, demanding complete and unconditional surrender instead. When the Pope asked why they were invading without provocation or grievance, the Mongols replied that they did not understand his words. They conquered because they could and because God had given them the entire earth to them.
Okay, so that's why the Crusader states make no alliance with the Mongols.
There was no option.
Right. Yeah.
And they were not strong enough themselves to fight them. There were talk about allying with the Mamluks to fight against the Mongols. But this time the Crusader states are disintegrating, and that you were asking, I think we'll come to the last question of why do they
Yeah,
disintegrate. So
that'll be the last one. So what did the can I just ask what did the obviously the Muslim, what we call the Muslim world, was really the occupied Christian world at this
yes,
point in time.
exactly, please,
So
exactly.
yeah, so what did the occupied Christian world, and by that I mean its Muslim overlords, think of the Crusader kingdoms during this period? How did they see them?
They
Obviously,
were
it was,
anathema. They had to be destroyed. I
yeah,
mean, Saladin, who so is normally seen as was such an enlightened king, wanted to destroy them, and he said he would continue fighting them, even from the grave. Let me see if I can find that quote. I mean, Saladin wanted to destroy them to the absolute, and Sharia law did not recognize peace
mm,
with a non-Muslim power. The maximum you could do was 10 years, 10 months, 10 days,
was a
because
truce,
was a truce of 10
not a
years,
peace.
10 months.
Yeah.
You could not make peace with any non-Muslim power. That was considered against Sharia law.
Mm,
They they were offended by them, they were upset by them, they were angered, that's why you kept, if a ruler was unpopular and you wanted to get popular, you rile up popular sentiment against these horrible, infidel states that have come, and Jerusalem had no meaning to Islam, but it was ours. It's ours because our troops are all over. It was ours because we were there once, and because any Muslim was ever there once, it's definitely ours still. The whole idea of dividing the world into Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb says it all. It's still the house of Islam and the house of war. If you aren't in the house of Islam, the only way to get peace is to conquer it so that everybody's part of the Dar.
Yeah. I mean, you hear modern echoes of that today. There are still Muslims that talk about Spain as if it should be Muslim because it was once occupied and conquered by Muslims. So that attitude, still reverberates in minorities of Muslims even now, and they often mourn it as if someone stole something from them rather than it being liberated. What can I just want to press on because we've got time whilst you're finding your quote. And this is the question that you've kind of already touched on. So I guess what we'll do is we'll just kind of land and sort of wrap up our thoughts. Why do you think then? What was it that ultimately? Why did the Crusader states fail? Considering that they were wealthy, considering that they treat Jews and Muslims relatively well compared to other examples of kingdoms at the time, considering that the fact that they had well-disciplined, standing military armies, considering the fact that it had deep religious significance, to the Latin kingdoms and to Byzantium. And the fact that they had military success for quite a number of centuries, were able to form alliances. Why is it?
I was going to say, and diplomatic successes, because they'd actually expanded after the Third Crusade. They expanded almost to their old borders, almost entirely by diplomatic success. They were not just killers. It's going to be when you put it in that context. This may sound hard to believe, but they were feudal kingdoms, although the kings were the first among equals and were actually elected by the high court, and it wasn't just primogeniture. They did try to keep it within the family of the last ruling monarch, and the crown goes to a woman, and they made the incredible. It seemed like a coup at the time. They married her, the most powerful Christian monarch on earth. They married Isabella II to Frederick II Hohenstaufen, who was the king of Sicily, king of the Romans, and Holy Roman Emperor. And the idea was he was going to have so many troops and resources, he was going to be able to shore up the kingdom of Jerusalem. And but in fact, for him, Jerusalem was unimportant because he had all these other things. And he spent less than a year in Jerusalem. He showed no interest in actually defending it. And his successors, his son and his grandson, never set foot in the kingdom. And when they died, there was a succession dispute. And then when it was finally decided on who should be king, the kingdom basically no longer existed. What I'm trying to say is that from basically 1220, even 1212 onwards, because the mother. Okay, let's say from 1225, when there was no resident king in the kingdom, and there was no rallying point, and there was nobody who was giving that kingdom the central authority. And so the factions start to, this is where it factionalizes. You'll hear a lot of talk about this before Hattin. It's actually not true. The kingdom was totally behind Baldwin IV. And they fought with him despite their differences, etc. But in the last 3/4 of the 13th century, without a strong central authority, the various factions, so the Pisans and Genoese are killing each other in the streets of Acre over their commercial disputes. The Hospitallers and the Templars are fighting each other on the streets because of their personal disputes. The barons are making separate peaces with various Muslim lords just to keep from losing. It disintegrates because there's no central authority which people respect and which and which is defending that state.
Right. So
So
it is, as Christ
it
said, a house
rots
divided against
basically.
itself falls.
It was rotting from the inside at the same time that the Ayyub princes are getting killed and being replaced by fanatic jihadists, and the Muslims and the Mongols are threatening, and distracting the rest of Europe. Because when you're fighting in Hungary and Poland to get the Mongols, suddenly Jerusalem doesn't seem quite as important.
Yeah, I've got you.
It's a combination. I don't think they would necessarily have fallen if there had not been the rot from the inside. I really think that was the more decisive factor. And the game I always like to play is, imagine if Richard I of England had been willing to do what his grandfather did, and that was to give up England, which he was going to lose to John anyways. If he'd given up England to become king of Jerusalem, and he'd married the heiress of Jerusalem, and he would have taken back Jerusalem. He would have pushed back those borders. He knew it. He was a brilliant commander. He was very savvy. He did not do what he couldn't. When he couldn't take Jerusalem, he said, "There's no point taking it if I can't hold it." So he didn't. He could have taken it. And if he'd first, which is what he wanted to do, completed the control of the coast, then gone down and attacked Egypt, pulled the Ayyubids would have fought. They weren't going to let him take Egypt. And he would have then taken the rest of Palestine and taken it back. And if you find a strong dynasty there, history could have been very different.
Yeah. Brilliant. Just bear with us 1 second. I just want to find a psalm, which I think is going to be a nice way to round this up. Bear with me just a moment. And then I will conclude. Okay. I just want to say, Dr. Schrader, this has been a really beautiful interview. I think it's been super educational. I've learned loads. I'm clearly being a man and can't multitask. And I want to encourage again people to go out and get this book. It is a great book that totally destroys a great number of myths, and because there are a lot of myths that surround this topic and surround the idea of the Crusades and the Crusader states. And I think you and others like you are doing a great job in correcting that. And, you're doing it from solid historical argument and solid historical investigation. So
I have to say, the Israeli historians have been some of the most important cutting edge people doing some of this revisionist history, which is really, really important. I'm very, very indebted to them. And that's what I'd like to stress about the book, is that I do give my sources. This is not opinion. Obviously, things are open to interpretation. People can challenge me on one or another thing, but it isn't, just made up. It's not just what I wish. There's the basis for this, and I've given my sources, and I've given the
who just as a and just again tell people what the book is.
The Holy Land in the Era of the Crusades, Kingdoms at the Crossroads of Civilization, which I think is very important, because that's really what they were. They really were a melting pot, and they were as a polyglot society.
Yeah, and if I remember, when Jerusalem fell, the Pope, am I right in thinking the Pope called for Psalm 78 to be read? Is that correct, or is that?
You're better on the Psalms than I am, Bob. Go ahead.
Fair enough. So I believe it was. Bear with us. Right, I think it was, but I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm going to read a psalm, but I'll read a shorter one, because Psalm 78 is a very long psalm, and whilst I don't personally have any hesitation in reading it, I don't want to make you sit through as I read this lament, so I'll read a shorter lament.
No, that's all right.
We'll read Psalm 79 instead. And this will be our closing prayer. And I just want to thank you again, Dr. Schrader, for your time. One final question before you go. Who do you think I should have on to interview next? If you could recommend someone to talk to on this topic or any other topic.
Oh, as I say, I don't know if you could get Batyor, who wrote this wonderful books about the Christianity in the Eastern Christianity. She's a scholar. If you could get her, I'm sure that would be fascinating.
What's her name? Sorry.
Bat, B-A-T, or Y-E apostrophe O-R.
Yeah, Btbsoco. Right. And
born in Egypt, a British citizen since 1959, is a recognized specialist on Jimmy's and Jimmy too. She wrote The Groundbreaking, etc., etc.
Don't suppose you could maybe introduce us.
No, I've never met her.
Oh, that's a shame. I'll reach out to her. But Dr. Btbsoco.
Brilliant. And another topic that I loved something totally different. I'm going to just shock you this time. I'm a huge admirer of Leonard Cheshire.
All right.
Ever done anything with him?
I have not. No. You'll have to sort of.
All right.
Yeah. We'll talk after the recording's finished, and then you can tell me a little bit more. But I'm going to read I'm going to read Psalm 79, and actually now. This is actually the psalm that at the fall of Jerusalem, when Jerusalem was taken by Saladin, and the news reached the Pope. This psalm was read and ordered to be read, I think, on a yearly basis, on an annual basis, to lament the loss of Jerusalem. So I feel it appropriate that we started with the Non Nobis Domini Non Nobis, which is obviously the psalm of the Knights Templar. That was their sort of chant. And we're going to end with the lament for the fall of Jerusalem. And this will be our closing prayer. And then we'll end the recording there. O God, the heathen hath come into thine inheritance. Thy holy temple have they defiled, and made Jerusalem an heap of stones. The dead bodies of thy servants have they given to be meat unto the fowls of the air, and the flesh of thy saints unto the beasts of the land. Their blood have they shed like water on every side of Jerusalem, and there was no man to bury them. We are become an open shame to our enemies, a very scorn and derision unto them that are round about us. Lord, how long wilt thou be angry? Shall thy jealousy burn like fire forever? Pour out thine indignation upon the heathen that have known thee not, and upon the kingdoms that have not called upon thy name. For they have devoured Jacob and laid waste his dwelling place. For remember not our old sins, but have mercy upon us, and that soon, for we are come to great misery. Help us, O God of our salvation, for the glory of thy name. O deliver us, and be merciful unto our sins, for thy name's sake. Wherefore do the heathen say, where is now their God? O let the vengeance of thy servants' blood that is shed be openly showed upon the heathen in our sight. O let the sorrowful sighing of the prisoners come before thee. According to the greatness of thy power, preserve thou those that are appointed to die. And for the blasphemy wherewith our neighbours have blasphemed thee, reward thou them, O Lord, sevenfold into their bosom. So we, that are thy people and sheep of thy pasture, shall give thee thanks forever, and will always be showing forth thy praise from generation to generation. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Amen.
I'm just going to end the recording, and then we'll talk. Thank you again, Dr. Schrader. That was absolutely brilliant. I've really enjoyed it. Right, bear with us. And good night, and God bless you all. I hope you enjoyed the live stream.